Hundreds of women vanish into the Bosporus, alive, bound, and doomed. No war, no plague, just a sultan's whispered command, and a night of mass murder. 1640 Constantinople. The Bosporus lies calm, its silver skin rippling in the moonlight, broken only by the creak of oarlocks and the low murmur of men speaking in a tongue meant not to be overheard. Imperial boats slice through the black water, their shapes swallowed by night, save for the glint of wet wood. Heavy sacks are dragged to the gunwale, bulging and thrashing as though the air itself is trying to escape. Without ceremony, they're heaved into the depths. A muted splash. Another. And another. No screams, only the slap of water against stone. The groan of rope under strain, the dull thud of something settling in the deep. The ripples spread wider and wider, as if the sea itself wishes to forget. The man who ordered this is Sultan Ibrahim I, emperor of the world's most sprawling Islamic realm, yet for most of his life a prisoner in the palace's gilded cage. Hidden away for over 2 decades before ascending the throne, he emerges into history with a mind warped by isolation. Born in confinement and raised in paranoia, the court whispers of his brilliance and his madness in equal measure, but tonight, no one doubts which side has won. The empire's treasury is drained, soldiers unpaid, citizens restless. Yet the Sultan's gaze is fixed, not on battlefields or borders, but on the silken corridors of his harem. Before the night ends, Constantinople will awaken to rumors that the Bosporus has been fed a feast of the empire's most beautiful captives. Some will call it jealousy, others, an omen from the stars, still others, a dream too vivid to ignore. Whatever the cause, the result is the same: hundreds gone beneath the waves, and an empire beginning to drown with them. This is the reign of Ibrahim the Mad, where silk and shadow, pleasure and paranoia, moonlight and murder collide. And like so many rulers who mistook their fears for destiny, he will leave behind not a legacy, but a warning. Before we descend into the corridors of Topkapi and the waters of the Bosporus, subscribe for more of history's darkest and absurd chapters. Give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far history's strangest nightmares travel. Now, why would a ruler drown his own harem? Let's go back to the beginning. It began, as executions often did in Constantinople, with a summons that was not a request. The women of the harem, some young, some long accustomed to its silken prison, were gathered in the dead of night. Lanterns hissed in the humid air, casting light that trembled against the marble walls. Guards moved with a strange, methodical urgency, as though time itself had been given orders. The imperial harem was no ordinary household. It was a city within a palace, its own laws, hierarchies, rivalries. In its chambers lived the sultan's favoured consorts, ambitious courtesans, and women brought from across continents as political gifts or purchased luxuries. To be summoned after dark was rarely cause for celebration. But on this night, there was no music, no scented oils, only silence and the rustle of rough cloth. One by one, the women were seized and bound. Sacks were brought, sturdy, coarse, smelling faintly of hemp and sea salt. Into each went a human life, folded down into a shape the guards could carry. Stones were tied at the feet, a grim counterweight to whatever hope might otherwise rise to the surface. The boats waited at the shore, their black hulls blending with the water. Inside, eunuchs and palace guards worked in practiced unison, lifting, swinging, releasing. The splash was dull and final, the sound of history erasing itself. Some accounts claim that as many as 280 women were cast into the Bosporus that night, a number so large it reads more like allegory than arithmetic. The Ottoman chronicler Mustafa Naima, closer to the event, records only several score. Historians argue over the figure, but the truth hides somewhere in the mist above the water, lost with the bodies. Not all went as planned. Fishermen in small boats, drawn by the sound of splashes and muffled cries, pulled a handful of women from the current. It was an act of mercy that would prove fatal, for the rescuers returned their catches to the palace at dawn, perhaps believing in justice, perhaps fearing the penalty for defiance. The women were promptly delivered back into sacks and returned to the Bosporus. The killings were carried out swiftly, without the theatre of public execution or the formality of trial. Yet their impact was immediate. Before sunrise, rumours had spread from the docks to the spice markets, from the Janissary barracks to the shadowed courtyards of the mosques. The whispers did not question if the massacre had occurred, they debated only why. Those who knew the palace understood this was no random cruelty. It was an act born of a ruler's mind turning in on itself, a mind both absolute and unstable. In a city accustomed to imperial violence, there was still something about this night that made people lower their voices when they spoke of it. Perhaps it was the scale, perhaps the intimacy, or perhaps it was the knowledge that when the Sultan's paranoia looked inward, no one behind palace walls was safe. And so, by the time the sun rose over Constantinople, the Bosporus was calm again. But beneath its silver surface, history had been given a secret graveyard, and an empire had taken one step closer to losing its balance. The Bosporus Massacre did not occur in a political vacuum. Within the palace, every action had meaning, often several contradictory meanings at once. The imperial court functioned like a mirror maze, each rumour reflected into a dozen variations, each fact bent into a different shape. And in that maze, the question of why the Sultan ordered the drowning of his own harem became a story as tangled as the harem itself. One explanation favoured by later chroniclers was the simplest: jealousy. Ibrahim I, they claimed, had become convinced that his concubines were unfaithful to him. In the tightly sealed world of Topkapi Palace, even the hint of such suspicion could spiral into catastrophe. The Sultan's word was not questioned. His doubts were not investigated. They were acted upon. If his mind conjured betrayal, it was as good as proven. Some accounts suggest that these fears were stoked by astrologers, whose charts foretold calamity for the Sultan's household unless certain corrupting influences were removed. In the 17th century, celestial warnings were taken with the seriousness of law. The stars were not consulted merely for romance or harvest. They were tools of state policy, and if those stars advised that treachery swam in the palace pools, then it was the Sultan's duty to drain them. Another theory leans toward the dream motif. It is said that Ibrahim awoke one morning in a state of panic, declaring that a vision had shown him his empire rotting from within. The imagery, vivid and unsettling, lingered in his mind until it took physical form in the execution orders. To a man raised in the golden cage, whose reality had always been shaped by whispers and shadows, a dream could carry the weight of truth. There was also the matter of Kösem Sultan, better known by the nickname Sugar Cube. She was Ibrahim's favourite consort, a woman of striking presence who, according to some chroniclers, preferred her rivals at the bottom of the Bosporus. Her influence over the Sultan was considerable, and in the palace's logic, removing competition was as much political manoeuvre as personal spite. Whether she whispered suggestions into his ear or merely enjoyed the benefits of his paranoia remains debated. Supporters of the political intrigue theory point out that the massacre destabilized long-standing alliances within the palace. The imperial harem was not simply a collection of romantic partners, it was a web of family ties, foreign hostages, and political leverage. Some concubines were daughters of provincial governors, or gifts from allied rulers. Their sudden deaths would send shockwaves through the empire's diplomacy, forcing officials to either fall in line or risk joining them in the depths. Others see the massacre as a calculated display of power, a bloody reaffirmation that the Sultan's will was absolute. In this interpretation, the killings were not about jealousy or astrology, but about reminding both palace and populace that the Sultan was master over life, death, and the fate of those closest to him. The absurdity, of course, is that such a display revealed weakness more than strength. A ruler confident in his authority rarely feels the need to strangle it into visibility. Still, The Ottoman court was no stranger to strange blends of motive. A decision might be fueled by genuine belief, manipulated by political opportunists, and justified through superstition, all in the same breath. In Ibrahim's case, the lines blur until every explanation seems plausible and none seems sufficient. This ambiguity made the massacre all the more dangerous. The Janissaries could not predict what would provoke the Sultan next. The ulema could not frame his decisions in terms of divine law without risking their own credibility. The viziers could not shape policy without fear of it being overturned by a dream, an omen, or a whisper from Sugar Cube's chambers. In a way, the massacre's mystery was its most destabilizing feature. If it could happen once, without warning, it could happen again, for any reason or no reason at all. And in an empire already stretched thin by debt, war, and restive provinces, uncertainty was more corrosive than even the loss of hundreds of lives. By the time the rumors reached the markets, the stories had already mutated. In some versions, the women were spies. In others, witches. In still others, a plague had infected the harem, and the Sultan, in an act of twisted mercy, had sent them to a cleaner death. No version made the act less terrifying, only more surreal. Thus, the Bosporus Massacre entered the city's memory not as a single clear-cut crime, but as a riddle in the form of a drowning. And, like all good riddles, it told the people less about the truth of events than about the mind of the man at their center, a mind in which love, fear, and empire were inseparably tangled. By morning, the waters of the Bosporus were still again, their surface betraying no sign of what had transpired. But the palace was not calm. The massacre, executed in darkness, began to leak into daylight in the form of whispers, glances, and sudden silences when certain topics arose. In an empire where news could travel faster than grain, the details spread with remarkable speed. The Janissaries heard it first from the fishermen who had been ordered to return the living. In the barracks, hardened soldiers exchanged looks that said more than their words. Many of them had guarded the palace for years. They knew the rhythms of imperial discipline. This was not discipline. This was something else, an eruption of the Sultan's will that defied both reason and precedent. The ulema, the empire's religious scholars, received the news in a different tone. For them, the killings raised questions of legitimacy and piety. While the Sultan's authority was absolute in worldly affairs, the drowning of women, many of them mothers or expectant mothers, risked crossing into the territory of divine judgment. Quietly, the ulema debated how far a ruler could go before his actions endangered the spiritual integrity of the state. Senior palace officials, particularly the viziers, understood the massacre as a sign of dangerous instability. The empire was already staggering under unpaid soldiers, tax arrears, and an empty treasury. Every coin was being squeezed twice before it left the mint. In such a climate, even small missteps could spark unrest. The deliberate killing of members of the imperial household was not a small misstep. It was a declaration that stability no longer held sway in the palace. The Ottoman court was a delicate machine, balanced between tradition and adaptability. Ibrahim's predecessors had managed crises by projecting either ruthless control or benevolent wisdom. This massacre projected neither. It suggested that the imperial will could swing wildly in any direction, today against the harem, tomorrow against the viziers, the next day perhaps against the Janissaries themselves. Rumors began to layer themselves atop the facts. Some claimed the Sultan had been advised by sorcerers, others said the harem had been plotting to poison him. A few, daring in their speculation, whispered that the Sultan had grown tired of them and wished to refresh the harem with new imports from distant markets. Whether believed or not, these stories deepened the sense that the palace was drifting into dangerous unpredictability. For the empire's enemies, both internal and external, the massacre was a gift. Discontented governors in the provinces could point to it as proof of imperial decay. European envoys, who prided themselves on sending back accurate, if embellished, reports of Ottoman affairs, now had a tale ready-made for diplomatic exploitation. The Venetian ambassador reportedly described the Sultan as a man beset by furies of the mind, a phrase that would find its way into later histories. Inside the palace, alliances began to shift. Kösem Sultan, the Sultan's mother, understood that the act would cost her son support among both the military and the bureaucrats. While she had worked tirelessly to shield Ibrahim from his own worst impulses, this time her influence had either failed or been bypassed entirely. The massacre was more than a tragedy, it was a breach in the wall of control she had tried to maintain. The Janissaries, whose loyalty had been tested before, now saw a ruler capable of endangering the empire from within. With their pay already months in arrears, the massacre gave them one more reason to view the palace as less a source of authority than a threat to their own survival. Soldiers who believed their ruler could not be trusted were soldiers who could be persuaded to act. Among the city's ordinary citizens, the news struck a different chord. Many had never seen the Sultan. He was a distant figure, glimpsed only during public ceremonies. But the harem was a symbol of imperial luxury, and its destruction, whether interpreted as madness or justice, was the kind of spectacle that etched itself into popular imagination. Market sellers spoke of the drowning as though they had witnessed it themselves. In coffee houses, the number of women killed seemed to grow with each telling. Far from strengthening his position, Ibrahim had undermined it. The massacre, rather than erasing potential threats within the harem, had multiplied them beyond counting. Every official, every soldier, every cleric now had a reason to wonder if they might be next. The act was meant, perhaps, to purge the palace of danger. In practice, it had poisoned the well from which the Sultan drew his legitimacy. And so, in the weeks that followed, the Bosporus lay quiet, but the empire did not. Beneath the surface of both water and politics, unseen currents began to pull at the foundations of the Sultan's rule. The drowning of the harem was not the end of Ibrahim's troubles. It was the point at which the tide began to turn against him, silently and irresistibly. Under the vaulted ceilings of the Topkapi Palace, winter sunlight often fell in pale ribbons, touching marble floors that knew the tread of many princes, some destined for the throne, others for a quieter end. In the year 1615 or 1616, one of those small figures was born into the house of Osman, the boy who would one day be Sultan Ibrahim I. His birth, like so many in the dynasty, was not celebrated in isolation but measured against the survival of others. In the harem, the joy of a newborn prince was tempered by the unspoken arithmetic of succession, where each cradle was shadowed by a bowstring. Ibrahim's father, Sultan Ahmed I, had broken with the custom of fratricide upon ascending the throne, sparing his brothers and instead confining them. It was a mercy, though perhaps a peculiar one, since life in the palace's inner chambers was far from free. Ahmed's decision meant that Ibrahim was born into a family where brothers were not slain outright but preserved in gilded captivity, a practice that kept potential rivals breathing and brooding. The air of the harem carried both the perfume of roses and the quiet rustle of intrigue. His mother, Kösem Sultan, was no mere court ornament. Born Anastasia, of Greek origin, she had risen from concubinage to become one of the most influential women in Ottoman history. Her intelligence was remarked upon by chroniclers, her political instincts sharper than many viziers. For Ibrahim, her presence was both shield and leash. She could protect him from immediate danger, but her reach also ensured that his early life unfolded entirely within her orbit. That protective instinct was tested brutally in the reign of his elder brother, Murad IV. Murad, known for his iron will and temper, ordered the execution of his surviving brothers, an act that would have included Ibrahim had Kösem not intervened. Contemporary accounts vary on the method of her persuasion, but all agree she saved him from certain death. Some say she pleaded that he was unfit for rule, too fragile to pose a threat. Others suggest she relied on the authority of a mother's word, which even a sultan could not easily ignore. Ibrahim's reprieve was not freedom. Instead, he was placed in the kafes, the so-called golden cage, a set of secluded chambers within the palace designed to confine princes until needed. The name was poetic, almost comforting, but the reality was a calculated form of solitary life. The lattice windows offered glimpses of gardens he could not walk in. The sounds of the city, market cries, the call to prayer, drifted in faintly, reminders of a world he was forbidden to join. For roughly 22 years, Ibrahim's world was bounded by the cafes. The walls were hung with silks. His food was fine. His attendants, mostly eunuchs, moved with silent efficiency. Yet the luxury did not disguise the absence of choice. Conversations were limited, visitors rare. Any news of the empire came filtered through whispers or the steady voice of a court official who might leave out as much as he told. In such conditions, time itself could become an enemy, stretching and folding in ways that left the mind unmoored. Occasionally, he would hear of events beyond those walls, wars waged at the empire's frontiers, executions in the palace courtyards, the arrival of foreign ambassadors. These were fragments of another reality, one in which he had no part. The cafes preserved his life, but it did so by suspending it. Many princes emerged from it changed, some subdued, others volatile. Chroniclers would later suggest that the man Ibrahim became was shaped as much by the absence of the world as by any experience within it. The paradox of the cafes was that it created heirs while simultaneously crippling them. It was designed to prevent palace coups by keeping potential rivals under watch, yet it often produced rulers unfamiliar with the mechanics of governance, diplomacy, or even normal human interaction. In Ibrahim's case, the cage preserved him as a piece on the imperial chessboard, carefully protected until the day he would be moved, whether he wished it or not. Kösem's role during this time cannot be overstated. She visited her son in the cafes, bringing small comforts, stories, advice, reassurances. These visits kept her influence alive, but they also reinforced his dependence on her. If Ibrahim imagined any future beyond those walls, it would have been through her eyes. Historians would later note that when his moment came to rule, he would turn to her instinctively, as though she were still the guardian of his survival. By the late 1630s, Murad IV's health began to fail. The court, accustomed to his forceful presence, began to murmur about succession. Ibrahim was the sole surviving brother, though in the logic of the palace, survival was never a guarantee until the moment it was sealed. Rumors reached him of Murad's declining condition, but he could not know whether they were truth, exaggeration, or bait to draw him into a fatal misstep. In the palace, even reality required verification. When the end came for Murad in 1640, Ibrahim remained in the cafes, unsure if his brother's death was genuine or part of some elaborate trap. His caution was not paranoia alone. In Ottoman history, feigned deaths had been used to flush out rivals. It was only when Kösem herself came to him and the body of Murad was shown that the truth became undeniable. In that moment, the boy who had been saved from the bowstring twice, once in infancy, once in youth, stood at the threshold of power. The irony was complete. A man kept alive by deliberate seclusion, presumed too delicate or dangerous to be free, would now inherit the vast machinery of the Ottoman Empire. The same walls that had confined him were opened not into a garden, but into the throne room. His survival had been assured. But what had been preserved was a mind shaped by decades of watchfulness, uncertainty, and the knowledge that in his family, life was never the opposite of death, merely its postponement. The corridors of the cafes were quiet enough to hear the tick of oil lamps cooling after they were snuffed. In those long silences, the human mind became its own weather system, clouds of suspicion forming from the smallest drafts of rumor, storms of anxiety gathering without warning. For Ibrahim, the golden cage was not merely a room but a horizon. Everything beyond it existed in uncertain half-light. The marble floors were cool underfoot, the air perfumed faintly with sandalwood, yet the comfort was lined with the awareness that this was not a home but a holding pen. Historians who have studied the effects of the cafes describe patterns that repeat across generations. Princes confined for years often emerged with an air of watchfulness, a reluctance to trust even those closest to them. The palace's eunuchs, tasked with both serving and surveilling, were as much wardens as attendants. Daily life became a theatre of formal courtesies, gestures stripped of warmth, conversations pruned of substance, until a prince could no longer tell whether someone's smile signified loyalty or duty. The toll was not immediate but cumulative. Days blurred into one another, the seasons marked only by changes in the quality of light filtering through lattice windows. Some princes occupied themselves with poetry or calligraphy, others with elaborate fantasies about the outside world. Ibrahim, according to later accounts, seemed to oscillate between restless energy and heavy withdrawal, his moods untethered from events. The cage's silence did not calm him. It gave his thoughts too much room. Paranoia took root easily in such soil. The knowledge that his brothers had been executed under orders from the same family he now depended on could not be unlearned. Every footstep outside his chamber might be the one that brought news of his own end. The eunuch's measured tread, the sound of a key turning, the faint clink of metal, these became signals to be read as omens. In such conditions, fear was not irrational. It was a rational response to an irrational system. Ibrahim was not unique in this. Chroniclers noted other princes who emerged from the cafes with peculiar fixations or aversions, unwilling to eat certain foods, distrustful of specific attendants, prone to sudden rages or fits of laughter. The isolation, meant to prevent political chaos, produced men ill-prepared to navigate the subtle games of the court without succumbing to them. In a structure designed for stability, the human mind was the one variable never fully controlled. Kösem Sultan's role in this environment was complex. She brought her son small luxuries, a favoured dish, fine fabrics, but these were not merely maternal gestures. They reinforced her as his only constant link to the outside world. If she wished, she could bring reassurance. If she wished, she could bring news calculated to unsettle him. Whether consciously or not, Ibrahim learned to interpret the smallest shifts in her tone or expression as signals of danger or safety. The cage also distorted time. Without duties, public appearances, or the rhythms of governance, Ibrahim's days could be filled or emptied at will. Hours of enforced idleness alternated with bursts of ceremonial formality, moments when he might be summoned to greet a dignitary or participate in a ritual, only to be returned immediately to confinement. It was a life punctuated by abrupt transitions, never allowing for a stable sense of reality. The confinement bred a peculiar mixture of dependency and resistance. On the one hand, Ibrahim relied entirely on the palace for food, news, and companionship. On the other, he learned to resent every reminder of that reliance. This tension may explain the erratic decisiveness he displayed later as Sultan, swift, unmeasured acts, followed by retreat into passivity. He had been trained not in leadership, but in survival, under constant observation. Some European visitors to the Ottoman court remarked on the system with a kind of fascinated horror. To their eyes, it was a political innovation that had traded open fratricide for something more insidious, death by slow estrangement from the world. Venetian envoys, reading between the lines of court gossip, noted that princes who had languished too long in shadow often came to the throne with nervous spirits and unsettled judgment. Such assessments, while coloured by foreign perspective, matched Ottoman accounts closely enough to suggest a consensus. Ibrahim's later fear of assassination, his sudden purges, and his susceptibility to astrologers and healers cannot be fully understood without this backdrop. The cafes taught him that threats could be invisible, that harm could come without warning, and that survival depended as much on interpreting hidden signs as on strength or decisiveness. To a ruler raised in such conditions, the line between reality and rumour was never entirely solid. Even moments of kindness within the cage carried a sharper edge. A feast in his honour might be followed by weeks of neglect. A rare walk in a garden could be revoked without explanation. The lessons were clear. Good fortune was temporary, trust provisional. What the cage preserved in flesh, it often eroded in mind. By the time Ibrahim was freed, he was not stepping out into an open world, but into a larger version of the same game. rooms with higher ceilings, corridors with more players, but always the same sense that somewhere, unseen, a key was turning in a lock. The news of Murad IV's death did not arrive in a rush, but in the measured, deliberate steps of a palace messenger. Ibrahim, still within the cafes, greeted it with suspicion. Death was a common visitor in the Ottoman court, but so too were false announcements meant to flush out rivals. For over 2 decades, every knock at his door had been a possible summons to the bowstring. Now, the message claimed that the empire awaited him. He did not believe it. Kösem Sultan was the one sent to convince him. She had navigated the tempests of 3 reigns and knew the precise mixture of persuasion and proof required. According to chroniclers, Ibrahim refused to leave his chamber until the body of Murad was brought to him. Even then, he hesitated, suspecting a trap. The irony was plain. The only man who could save him from the cage was the one he had feared most, and now he had to trust that man's death. The moment was charged with both ceremony and unease. Attendants laid out the imperial robes, their folds rich with gold thread, and presented the sword of Osman, its hilt warm from many hands. To most heirs, such symbols signaled triumph. To Ibrahim, they were reminders that power was merely another form of exposure. Every sultan had enemies. Every throne was a scaffold in disguise. Those present recorded that he stepped into the garments reluctantly, his expression unreadable. Kösem, standing close, assured him that the Janissaries were loyal, that the viziers awaited his command, and that the people prayed for his rule. Whether she believed all of this is unknown. In the palace, sincerity was often indistinguishable from strategy. Ibrahim, conditioned to see danger in every promise, absorbed the words with guarded silence. The procession from the cafes to the throne room was short, but for Ibrahim it must have felt like crossing a continent. The tiled halls gleamed under lamplight, their walls lined with silent witnesses, officials, guards, servants, each a potential ally or conspirator. The sounds of the city beyond the palace gates seemed distant, as though he was still behind the latticework of his cage. When he reached the throne, the rituals began. The kiss of the imperial standard, the recitation of the oath, the formal greetings of the court. The Janissary Agas bowed in unison, a sight meant to reassure, though their faces betrayed nothing. Ibrahim's voice, when he spoke, was steady but low. The man who had been hidden from the empire now stood at its center, unsure whether the ground beneath him was solid or already giving way. Kösem maintained a visible presence throughout the ceremony. She directed the flow of officials, received envoys, and ensured that her son's first acts as sultan followed established protocol. To the court, this suggested continuity. To Ibrahim, it confirmed that the habits of dependency from the cafes would continue into his reign. In his mind, the line between his own will and his mother's remained porous. Outside the palace, word of the new sultan's ascension spread quickly. In the markets, coffee houses, and mosques, the talk was cautious. Murad IV had ruled with severity and order. His successor was an enigma. Some hoped that Ibrahim, having known long confinement, would be merciful. Others feared that a man shaped by isolation might lack the steel required to govern. In the Ottoman world, uncertainty was rarely a comfort. The days following his ascension were marked by a strange blend of inertia and ceremony. Ibrahim issued proclamations under Kösem's guidance, attended divan meetings without asserting himself, and received foreign ambassadors with the same measured politeness he had once used in the cage. The empire continued to function, but its new ruler remained a shadow at the center of the machinery. The Janissaries, ever attuned to shifts in imperial temperament, noted his hesitations. A sultan who delayed decisions might be swayed, one who doubted his own position could be moved. These observations were not yet threats, but they were the first quiet calculations in a game that never stopped. Ibrahim's reluctance to claim the throne outright left openings that others would soon explore. In private moments, he is said to have expressed a desire to return to the cage, an admission less about nostalgia than about safety. In the cafes, He had known the limits of his prison. On the throne, those limits were harder to see. Power, he realized, did not dissolve confinement. It merely expanded its walls. Thus began a reign born not of ambition but of survival, presided over by a man who had been prepared for every danger except the one he now faced, ruling an empire that expected certainty from someone who had spent most of his life doubting everything. The first steps out of the cage had been taken, but the habits of a captive would follow him into every chamber of the palace. Winter fog rolled in from the Sea of Marmara, softening the outline of Constantinople's walls. Minarets stood like watchful sentinels, their stone spires piercing the haze. Beneath them, the markets moved with a steady rhythm, merchants haggling over figs and silk, fishermen unloading their catch with the same care as priests preparing an altar. The city, though never free of intrigue, lived under a certain predictability, the sort of order that comes not from kindness, but from a ruler's absolute certainty. Murad IV, Ibrahim's elder brother, had imposed that certainty with a precision that could be measured in both coin and compliance. The treasury, once groaning under debts and unpaid soldiers, had been forced back into balance. The streets were patrolled by Janissaries who, whatever their private grievances, moved like a single organism under his command. Those who defied his edicts, against alcohol, tobacco, and other perceived corruptions, often vanished from view without fanfare. Order was maintained not through persuasion, but through the absence of alternatives. In the palace, Murad governed with a hand both steady and severe. Council sessions unfolded in the shadow of his presence. Viziers measured their words as though each syllable might tip a scale. Envoys from Venice, Persia, and the Crimean Khanate crossed the marble courtyards, knowing precisely how far they could press their advantage before meeting the limits of Ottoman patience. If the Sultan's moods shifted, they shifted within known bounds. The bureaucracy could anticipate them. And that predictability was a kind of stability. Beyond the capital, the empire's reach was still formidable. The Anatolian heartland sent its grain, Egypt and the Levant, their taxes, the Danubian provinces, their tribute in gold and manpower. The Ottoman fleet patrolled the Aegean and Black Seas, its sails catching the wind with the inevitability of a tide. Even at the empire's frontiers, where Persia tested its strength and European powers eyed its trade, the state's grip remained unshaken. Kösem Sultan, mother to both Murad and Ibrahim, moved quietly in this environment. Her influence was rarely declared aloud, yet her presence threaded through every layer of court life. Gifts arrived at her apartments from provincial governors eager for imperial favor. Messengers came and went at odd hours, carrying instructions that bore no official seal but were obeyed nonetheless. She had mastered the art of governing from the shadows, a skill sharpened during the reigns of her sons. For the people of Constantinople, this period was not without hardship. Taxes had increased, and Murad's prohibitions weighed heavily on daily life. Coffee houses, once hubs of conversation, politics, and poetry, were shuttered or driven underground. Music that carried the wrong associations could draw suspicion, yet there was also a grim reassurance in knowing the rules, however harsh. The city's heartbeat was steady, even if its arteries were constricted. The palace itself reflected this ordered severity. Its halls were austere, ornamentation kept in check by Murad's taste for discipline over display. State ceremonies were conducted with the dignity of long tradition, unbroken by novelty. The harem, while politically significant, was managed with a clear hierarchy and discreet discipline. Courtiers learned to avoid the kinds of extravagances that might provoke the Sultan's notice for the wrong reasons. Murad's personal presence in military campaigns reinforced the empire's cohesion. When Baghdad was taken in 1638, the victory was followed by a treaty with Persia that stabilized the eastern border. Such achievements fed the perception that the Sultan's will was both unyielding and beneficial to the state. This perception, in turn, gave weight to the bureaucracy's daily operations, which thrived under the certainty of imperial backing. Even the Janissaries, often restive under weaker rulers, operated with a measure of restraint. They knew Murad could and would, punish dissent directly, without the delay of formal inquiries. Pay arrived with more regularity than in later years, and the corps retained its position as both military vanguard and political force, though tightly leashed. Religious authority, too, was in alignment with the throne. The ulema lent theological weight to Murad's policies, from his moral prohibitions to his military campaigns. Friday sermons reinforced the idea that imperial will and divine order were not merely aligned, but indistinguishable. In this climate, dissent was not just treason against the Sultan, but an affront to the order of the world itself. Yet beneath this surface stability, the structures were rigid rather than flexible. They could bear the weight of discipline, but not necessarily the strains of erratic command. The bureaucrats who flourished under Murad's constancy were not prepared for a ruler who might contradict himself before the ink dried on a decree. The Janissaries, accustomed to firm direction, would not respond well to orders that shifted with the stars or with a dream. It was, in many ways, a stage set for a single kind of performance, one in which the Sultan's mind was as disciplined as his armies. When the curtain rose on Ibrahim's reign, the scenery remained the same. The marble courtyards, the fortified walls, the intricate hierarchy of court and city. But the actor stepping into the role would not deliver the same lines, and the audience, though patient at first, would soon realize the play had changed. In those last months before Murad's death, no one in the city markets, the palace kitchens, or the chambers of the divan could have predicted the precise nature of what was to come. Yet in hindsight, the contrast between the measured severity of the brother and the unpredictable impulses of the successor would become one of the most jarring shifts in Ottoman history, the difference between a steady current and a riptide that pulled without warning. The first months of Ibrahim's reign moved with the inertia of his brother's policies. Edicts were issued in familiar language, ceremonies followed their accustomed order, and ministers still filed their reports in the same gilded folders. Yet within the high gates of Topkapi Palace, a subtle drift had begun. The new sultan's attention wandered from matters of state to matters of sensation. It began with gardens. Murad's courtyards, once functional and clipped, became experiments in abundance. Tulips, hyacinths, and roses bloomed in improbable combinations, imported from distant provinces at great expense. Pavilions sprouted among the flower beds, lacquered in bright colours that caught the light like enamel. The palace grounds, once symbols of imperial restraint, now suggested a pleasure estate where the seasons themselves were summoned at the ruler's whim. From the gardens, the indulgence spread to clothing. Ibrahim's robes grew heavier with furs from Crimea, sable from Russia, and leopard skins acquired through North African intermediaries. Gold thread embroidery swirled over silks so thick they creased like paper when folded. Servants remarked that each audience required a different ensemble, as though diplomacy were a theatrical production and the costumes as vital as the script. Animals became another fascination. White elephants, parrots from the Indian Ocean islands, and a trained lion occupied a section of the palace courtyard. The harem's fountains, designed for soft splashing, now echoed with the guttural calls of exotic birds. Courtiers adapted quickly, finding ways to present each new creature as a diplomatic gift rather than a household acquisition, so that extravagance could masquerade as statecraft. The harem itself transformed most of all. Ibrahim's preference for plus-sized women became a guiding principle in its recruitment, altering both the composition and the politics within. Envoys and merchants who once sought favour with fine textiles or rare spices now competed to deliver women matching the Sultan's tastes. Sugar Cube, his most favoured consort, emerged from this environment not merely as a companion but as an axis of influence, her position bolstered by her ability to anticipate, and sometimes direct, his desires. The rhythms of governance began to bend around these pleasures. Morning councils grew shorter, sometimes skipped entirely, replaced by excursions along the Bosporus in pleasure barges fitted with velvet canopies. The Sultan's presence in the divan became unpredictable. Ministers arrived prepared for audience, only to be told the Sultan was indisposed, occupied with matters that left no record in the imperial archives. Lavish entertainments blurred the line between festival and governance. Musicians played beneath lantern-strung trees while foreign envoys waited for their turn to speak. Feasts extended deep into the night, their expenses drawn from a treasury already strained by unpaid military salaries and rising provincial unrest. The palace cooks, once tasked with feeding the court, now managed banquets designed to astonish, peacocks roasted with their feathers reattached, sherbets flavoured with imported snow from Mount Olympus. With each indulgence, the machinery of the state adjusted itself in small but telling ways. Courtiers learned to present petitions during moments of good humour, or to attach policy proposals to the arrival of some new luxury. Decisions once shaped by the Council of Viziers now hinged on private conversations in perfumed chambers, where the rustle of silk was as constant as the Sultan's shifting attention. Beyond the walls, the people of Constantinople took note. Taxes rose to sustain the expanding court life, and rumours multiplied in the markets. Stories of jewelled saddles for horses that never left the palace, or perfumed oils imported by the barrel, became part of the city's gossip economy. Even the fishermen along the Golden Horn claimed to have seen barges weighted with nothing but cushions and musicians, drifting past like floating salons. To the Janissaries, such extravagance was more than spectacle. It was evidence of a ruler losing the discipline necessary for command. They measured this not in gardens or garments, but in delayed pay and inconsistent orders. For the ulema, the shift carried theological unease. The court's excess suggested a turning from divine purpose toward worldly distraction. Ministers, caught between duty and survival, learned the art of agreeing in public while maneuvering in private. Yet, for a time, the transformation seemed almost benign. The empire still stood, the fleets still sailed, the provinces still sent their tribute. The changes within the palace were interpreted by some as a harmless flowering after Murad's severity, a season of colour before the next campaign. But beneath the bright silks and blooming gardens, the same currents that had once carried the empire forward were beginning to pull in unpredictable directions. It was in this climate of opulence and shifting priorities that the balance between ruler and realm began to tilt, so gradually that few recognized the moment when indulgence ceased to be decoration and became the architecture of the reign itself. The empire's treasury had always been a ledger of contradictions, coins flowing in from distant provinces, only to vanish into the machinery of war, administration, and ceremony. Under Ibrahim, the balance tipped decisively toward ceremony. Gardens, silks, jewels, and gifts to favoured courtiers swelled the columns marked expenditure. The columns marked revenue lagged behind, burdened by provinces slow to pay and a capital weary of rising taxes. For the Janissaries, the change was felt in coin more than rumour. Salaries, once regular under Murad, began arriving late or in partial sums. The delay carried an unspoken insult. While soldiers counted copper in the barracks, the Sultan paraded in furs and hosted feasts where sherbets were chilled with imported snow. The image was not one of shared hardship, but of a ruler whose priorities had drifted far from the discipline that bound his armies. In the streets, tax collectors met with resistance that ranged from polite delay to open defiance. Merchants complained of levies that rose without warning, while guilds found themselves squeezed for gifts to the palace. Each new festival, each elaborate harem indulgence, seemed to arrive on the backs of those who had no part in the enjoyment. Public morale, once sustained by the sense of belonging to an invincible empire, began to thin. The machinery of governance, too, grew unsteady. Viziers who had once debated policy in the divan found themselves waiting for audiences that never came, their recommendations overtaken by the whispered council of astrologers and soothsayers. Ibrahim placed particular faith in Sinchi Hoka, a former sorcerer turned court favourite, whose advice on matters of state was filtered through dreams and omens. Decisions once anchored in law and precedent now veered according to the alignment of planets. Those who questioned these shifts met with swift removal. Some were exiled to provincial posts, others quietly executed. The result was a council increasingly populated by those who agreed before being asked. Their loyalty measured not in service to the empire, but in service to the mood of the Sultan. The channels through which dissent might once have been heard were narrowed, then closed entirely. In the harem, Sugar Cube's influence deepened. Her rivals found themselves dismissed, reassigned, or, as whispers claimed, quietly removed from the palace. Access to Ibrahim now often passed through her, giving her control over what matters reached his attention at all. Ministers, recognizing the shift, began sending her gifts alongside official petitions, a practice that blurred the line between governance and household politics. The provinces, meanwhile, saw opportunity in the centre's distraction. Local governors began holding back a portion of tax revenues, confident that the palace's attention was fixed elsewhere. Reports of unrest in Anatolia and the Balkans filtered into the capital, but the response was delayed, and when it came, it was inconsistent. Military expeditions were ordered, then cancelled. Commanders were appointed, then replaced before departure. Religious authority, once a steady partner to the throne, grew uneasy. The ulema watched as palace expenditures outpaced military readiness, and as the Sultan's public appearances became associated more with spectacle than piety. Friday sermons still praised the imperial household, but the tone shifted. Subtle reminders of a ruler's duty to justice and restraint began to thread through the rhetoric. The Janissaries, ever attuned to weakness, started meeting in private, their officers discussing the risks of a ruler who could not keep the treasury filled or the chain of command intact. They did not yet speak of revolt, but the old bond between core and crown was loosening. Loyalty, they knew, was easiest to maintain when both pay and purpose were certain. In the markets of Constantinople, the fracture was visible in rumour as much as fact. Stories of the Sultan's eccentric purchases travelled faster than official decrees. Jewelled saddles for horses that were never ridden, rooms lined entirely with sable fur, astrologers rewarded with gold for predicting fair weather. Whether these stories were true mattered less than that they were believed, and each telling pushed the Sultan further from the image of a steady hand at the helm. Within the palace, the contrast between the outer world's unease and the inner world's indulgence widened daily. For those who had served under Murad, it felt as though the empire's central pillar was beginning to split, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, creeping fracture that might be ignored until it was too wide to bridge. By the time the signs were undeniable, the unpaid soldiers, the defiant provinces, the whispering council, the fracture was no longer a crack. It was a fault line running through the empire's foundations, and it would not be repaired by tulip gardens or jewelled robes. The stage was set for confrontation, and the actors had already taken their places. It began, as such things often did in Constantinople, not with a trumpet but with a murmur. In the narrow lanes near the barracks, soldiers leaned closer over their bread and soup, speaking names in lowered tones. The August heat lay heavy on the city, thickening tempers and quickening disputes. Some claimed to have seen omens in the skies over the Golden Horn. Others needed no celestial excuse. The Janissaries' pay was overdue, the palace treasury half empty, and the court too absorbed in its silks to notice. The news that broke the restraint was not a military defeat or foreign incursion, but the death of Hezarpare Ahmed Pasha. The Grand Vizier's nickname, 1,000 pieces, had been earned in bureaucratic diligence, not in dismemberment, though the irony would not survive the day. Rumours swelled that his dismissal and execution had been the whim of the palace, another turn in Ibrahim's theatre of suspicion. By evening, the soldiers were no longer whispering. They were counting who might stand with them. The ulema, sensing the shift, began to shape their sermons accordingly. Constantinople's streets are rarely still, but on the morning of the 8th of August, they seemed to vibrate with an unspoken accord. Messengers passed between the barracks and the mosques, their errands quick and without ornament. Shutters stayed half-closed along the main market roads, as if merchants feared to commit to one side or the other. The Bosporus glittered under a cloudless sky, a reminder that the palace still stood untouched, but not unapproached. The Janissaries moved first, their columns threading through the city in deliberate silence. They wore no banners, yet their presence was a declaration. Crowds followed at a careful distance, drawn by the gravity of the moment, the way one might watch a storm form offshore. Inside the palace, reports arrived in quick succession. The soldiers were not dispersing, they were converging. The Sultan's guards remained at their posts, but their loyalty was already being weighed against the wind. Ahmed Pasha's fate was spoken of in the same breath as the massacre of the harem. One had been an execution in daylight, the other a disposal in darkness, but both spoke of a ruler deaf to counsel. Those who had tolerated eccentricity could not forgive unpredictability. It was bad for trade, worse for politics, fatal for armies. Kösem Sultan, no stranger to such currents, began to receive visitors who did not announce themselves. Each audience ended with the same unspoken conclusion: the tide could not be reversed. In the city's coffee houses, patrons spoke of the Sultan as if he were already gone. Stories grew in the telling. Ibrahim dressing in furs in the summer heat, chasing pigeons through the gardens, commissioning fleets of pleasure barges while soldiers went unpaid. These accounts were not all false, but they were selective, sharpened for effect. The revolt needed not just cause, but poetry. Nothing stirs a crowd like the sense they are living in an allegory. The palace gates became the focus by midday. The Janissaries did not assault them. They simply stood, their numbers growing as more units arrived from the outskirts. The stillness was calculated, more dangerous than a charge. Inside, court officials shuffled between chambers, speaking in clipped sentences, their steps echoing off marble floors. Some clutched petitions, others resignation drafts. When the gates finally opened, it was not to release defenders but to admit negotiators. The terms, though not formally written, were clear. Ibrahim must be removed. The ulema had already prepared the legal justifications, citing preservation of the empire's stability as both duty and mercy. The Janissaries required little convincing. Their payment would come from the next ruler's hand. Outside, the crowds murmured approval, the air smelling of sweat, incense. That evening, as the city lamps flickered to life, word spread that Ibrahim had been taken into custody. No resistance was reported, only a strange quiet, as though he were relieved to be spared further decisions. Witnesses spoke of his gaze drifting toward the windows, perhaps imagining the Bosporus beyond. Kösem remained in her chambers, receiving updates without visible reaction. She had navigated storms before. This one merely required a different course. In the days that followed, order returned with a suspicious neatness. The soldiers received their arrears, the markets reopened, but the palace corridors carried a new echo, the absence of a sultan's unpredictable footstep. Ibrahim's name was now spoken in the past tense, though his body remained within the walls. It was a pause, not an ending. And those who knew Ottoman politics understood that pauses could be lethal. Evening breezes off the water cooled the city once more, carrying the smell of brine through the narrow streets. In the taverns, they were already telling the story as if it had happened years ago. How the Janissaries came without banners, how the gates opened without bloodshed, how a ruler vanished into the palace and never re-emerged. The truth was less tidy, but history often prefers clean outlines. For now, the empire had a new center of gravity and a sultan in waiting. The days after his arrest passed with a quiet that was almost unnatural for the palace. There were no public decrees, no processions, no triumphant displays. The empire moved as if nothing had happened, though everyone knew something had. The man who had once summoned dancers at midnight and astrologers at dawn now occupied a single, guarded chamber. The golden cage had returned, not as childhood confinement, but as holding cell. Ibrahim's room overlooked an inner courtyard where light fell in narrow columns. He paced at first, demanding explanations from the guards, calling for his mother, his sons, his consorts. Responses came in careful tones, or not at all. Meals were brought on silver trays, the lids lifting to release steam into the still air, yet the food seemed untouched when they were taken away. Some believed he was fasting, Others thought he had lost his appetite for the living world. Kösem Sultan visited only once. She entered without ceremony, her presence filling the chamber more than its sparse furnishings. Their exchange, recorded in whispers by attendants outside, was brief. She spoke of the empire's needs, the necessity of calm, the will of God as expressed through the law. When she left, her veil shifted slightly in the breeze, but her pace did not slow. Outside the palace, the decision had already hardened into inevitability. The ulema confirmed their legal opinion. A ruler who endangered the empire could be removed by force. The Janissaries, content with their restored pay, stood ready to enforce it. What remained was formality, and, in Ottoman tradition, formality required silence and precision. Execution was to be carried out without the spilling of royal blood. On the morning of the 18th of August, 1648, the palace corridors were unusually empty. Steps echoed as the appointed officials approached Ibrahim's chamber. The bowstring they carried was concealed in cloth, though its purpose was not. Witnesses later said he looked up with something between recognition and resignation. Perhaps he had known from the moment the gates closed behind him 10 days earlier. The act itself left no mark on the marble floors. The bowstring was swift, the room still except for the sound of breathing, and then the absence of it. The guards stepped back, leaving the chamber as it had been, only quieter. Outside, the sun continued its climb over the city, gilding the domes and minarets. Few in the streets knew the exact moment the empire had changed hands. In the hours that followed, attendants moved through the palace with studied composure. The body was prepared according to custom, shrouded and taken to rest among his forebears. There was no public display, no state mourning beyond the required prayers. The empire had already turned its gaze toward the new sultan, Ibrahim's 6-year-old son, Mehmed IV. The child was brought to the throne under Kösem's watchful eye. Some in the palace claimed Ibrahim's final days had been marked by calm acceptance. Others whispered that he had called out in the night for the women lost to the Bosporus, hearing their voices in the splash of fountains. Such stories blurred quickly into legend, becoming part of the Sultan's shadowed reputation. Official records simply noted his death and the succession, as if closing a ledger. In the Ottoman archive, there is no flourish, only a line between two reigns. Kösem's role in approving the act was no secret. Her influence ensured the transition appeared orderly, even merciful. To her, this was not personal vengeance, but the necessary pruning of a branch that threatened the whole tree. Still, some in the court wondered whether the mother who had once saved her son from execution now felt the weight of reversing that choice. If she did, history offers no record of it. The man who had once feared the throne had been freed from it, in the only way the palace allowed. In the end, he returned to the cage, not gilded this time, and not with the possibility of release. The empire moved on, its waters once again reflecting the moon without interruption. But in the private corridors of memory, Ibrahim remained, a figure of silk, suspicion, and silence. And for those who had lived through his reign, the sound of the bowstring would echo long after the act itself. The palace wasted no time in resetting the stage. By the following morning, the boy Sultan Mehmed IV was presented to the court, his small frame dwarfed by the throne's carved arms. Kösem Sultan stood just behind him, the real axis of authority in those first days. The Janissaries, satisfied with the new arrangement, offered formal salutes. The ulema recited the verses that marked divine approval. In the official register, the empire had moved seamlessly from one reign to another. But history did not erase Ibrahim so neatly. His name lingered in the markets, the coffee houses, and the barracks. Not with fondness, but with a fascination reserved for rulers whose eccentricities threatened the state itself. Chroniclers, eager to capture the drama, balanced between courtly discretion and popular appetite. Mustafa Naimer's account would immortalize the Bosporus Massacre as a signpost of imperial derangement. Others folded the story into the larger cautionary tale of the cafes system. To the Ottomans of the 17th century, the Bosporus was more than a body of water. It was the artery of the empire, carrying goods, soldiers, and power between continents. That it could also carry the weight of a harem's collective fate turned it into a symbol of what happens when personal paranoia overrides governance. Fishermen claimed the waters were quieter after that night, though such claims were more poetry than meteorology. The massacre became shorthand for the dangers of leaving the empire's helm in unstable hands. It was a warning wrapped in the silk of palace life. Kösem's return to dominance was swift and almost total. As regent, she managed court factions with the same precision she had shown under previous sultans. Her influence over the young Mehmed IV cemented her position, at least for the moment. To her allies, Ibrahim's removal was proof of her political foresight. To her critics, it was the ultimate confirmation that even the throne could be a pawn in palace games. Beyond the capital, provinces noted the change with cautious optimism. Tax shipments resumed, correspondence with governors regained its regular rhythm, and the Janissaries restored their role as enforcers rather than kingmakers. But under the surface, the memory of instability remained. It was not forgotten that the same soldiers who saluted Mehmed had, only days before, stood ready to unseat his father. Power in the Ottoman world had always been conditional. Ibrahim had simply demonstrated the terms more vividly. In foreign courts, ambassadors sent dispatches that blended relief with curiosity. Venetian and Habsburg observers recorded the Sultan's downfall with an air of inevitability. The more theatrical rumours of harem drownings, astrologers' influence, and extravagant tastes found their way into European salons, where Ottoman politics were both exoticized and lampooned. Ibrahim's reign thus entered the Western imagination not as a chapter of governance, but as an episode of imperial excess. It was a portrayal the empire could neither confirm nor entirely deny. Within Ottoman chronicles, his name was often followed by a sigh, literal or implied. The annalists did not linger on his policies, for there were few to record. Instead, they catalogued his whims. The furs in summer, the gilded barges, the preference for women of a certain stature. Even in official language, a certain irony crept in, as though acknowledging that some reigns cannot be summarized without their peculiarities. He was both sultan and cautionary proverb. The kafes system itself did not vanish with Ibrahim's fall. Princes would still be raised in gilded isolation, protected from fratricide yet subject to its psychological toll. His life became a case study for critics of the practice. Though reform was slow and reluctant, the empire valued stability over experiment. Even a broken wheel might be kept if it fit the cart. In that sense, Ibrahim was less an anomaly than a byproduct. Over time, the Bosporus Massacre passed from lived memory into folklore. Ballads hinted at the drowned women, their names replaced with symbols or omens. Fishermen's tales merged with superstition, claiming that certain tides carried whispers. The truth, as always, grew harder to extract the longer it was told. What remained certain was that a single night's order had shifted the course of a reign. For those who studied the empire's history, Ibrahim's decade in the cage and 8 years on the throne formed a perfect circle. He began as a prince cut off from the world, and ended as a ruler cut off from power. The difference lay only in the doors that locked behind him. His reign did not end in flames or invasion, but in the quiet of a closed room and the slip of a bowstring. The empire, as it always had, moved on. Yet, like the echo of waves against the palace walls, his legacy persisted in the background noise of Ottoman politics. It was a reminder that an empire could survive its rulers, but not without cost. In Ibrahim's case, the cost was measured in lives, in trust, and in the uneasy knowledge that the Bosporus could conceal both commerce and catastrophe. For the chroniclers, this was the final image, moonlight on the water, and the memory of a reign sinking beneath it. The surface smooth again, but never truly still. Once, he had been a boy in the golden cage, spared the bowstring by his mother's hand. 2 decades later, he left it only to return, not as a prisoner awaiting the future, but as a ruler whose future had been decided. Between those walls, Ibrahim's reign rose and fell, without ever finding solid ground. He governed by whim, feared shadows more than armies, and mistook indulgence for stability. The empire endured him, but it did not forget him. The Bosporus Massacre became the emblem of his rule, a single night's decision that encapsulated years of suspicion and isolation. No edict could erase the image of weighted sacks slipping beneath the moonlit water. It was a story told by fishermen, whispered in markets, and preserved by chroniclers who knew a potent symbol when they saw one. Ibrahim's name was joined to it in perpetuity, a bond as immovable as the currents themselves. Even in the quiet of archives, the massacre's weight is felt between the lines. Kösem Sultan outlasted her son, guiding the empire once more from behind the throne. Her survival testified to the skill of one who understood that in Ottoman politics, the choice was often between being the executioner or the executed. Ibrahim's fate was framed as necessity, not betrayal, though history seldom distinguishes between the two for long. In her version of events, it had been an act to save the empire. In the telling of others, it was the final scene in a drama she had directed from the start. The cafes endured, producing more princes, more rulers, and perhaps more cautionary tales. Ibrahim was not its only product, merely its most infamous. To critics, he proved that survival could be its own undoing. To defenders, that instability was the price of avoiding blood in the succession. Both sides agreed only on the fact that the system had shaped him. In the cage, he had learned to live without the outside world, and in power, he had ruled as if it were still at a distance. In foreign lands, his reign became entertainment. Venetian envoys reported his eccentricities with the flourish of a playwright's pen. Paris salons retold his story as an oriental curiosity, where silks, harems, and sudden drownings blurred into spectacle. The reality was less theatrical, but no less strange. Like many rulers before him, Ibrahim was both more and less than the legend. Centuries later, the city he ruled has changed names, languages, and empires. The Bosporus still divides continents, its waters busy with ferries and freighters. No trace remains of the night the sacks were cast into its depths, but in the mind's eye, the scene endures. Moonlight breaking on water, ripples widening, a boat pulling silently away. It is a tableau that belongs as much to history as to memory. The empire survived him, as it had survived storms, plagues, and sieges. Yet the damage of his reign was not in territory lost, but in trust eroded. His story became less about the man and more about the dangers of unchecked isolation, of a ruler who emerged from darkness only to cast shadows of his own. In the end, Ibrahim's legacy is not a chapter, but a caution, one that, like the Bosporus, appears calm from the surface, while its depths hold what has been deliberately sunk. And so the mad sultan remains, suspended between history and legend, not a tyrant in the grand sense, nor a reformer in any, but a reminder that the fate of empires can turn on the smallest hinges. A whispered rumour, a mother's intervention, a knight's decision on the water. What the palace recorded as succession, the people remembered as a drowning. And what the chronicles call the end of a reign, the Bosporus still holds in its silent, unbroken tide.